This is our first week on Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex. The question that de Beauvoir asks in this book is on the top of page 5. The question is, what is a woman? And de Beauvoir's answer, on page 6, is that she is the other. So this is the first thing we need to understand. What does it mean for a woman to be other? De Beauvoir writes, there's an absolute human type, and that is masculine. Humanity is male, and man defines woman not in herself, but in relation to himself. She is not considered an autonomous being. She is determined and differentiated in relation to man, while he is not in relation to her. She is the inessential in front of the essential. He is subject, he is absolute, she is other. So the thought here is that man is subject insofar as man defines himself positively in his own terms and through his own projects, while woman is other insofar as she is defined negatively in opposition to man, in terms of not being man and not undertaking man's projects. Now the first example that de Beauvoir gives of being other is on page 5. She says, if I want to define myself, I first have to say, I am a woman. All other assertions will arise from this basic truth. A man never begins by positing himself as an individual of a certain sex. That he's a man is obvious. Now, an obvious example of this sort of phenomenon would be our thinking of LeBron James, for example, as the greatest athlete, and Serena Williams as the greatest female athlete. Here, we're defining LeBron James in terms of a project he's freely taken on. LeBron James freely chose to be a basketball player. Serena Williams, by contrast, we're defining not in the first instance in terms of a project she freely chose, but rather in terms of her being a woman, something she didn't freely choose. If we think of Serena Williams as the greatest woman athlete, we're thinking of her in the first instance as a woman, and only secondarily in terms of the project she's freely chosen. So now, the first question that I want you to think about is how widespread do you think this phenomenon is? Is it just in athletics that we define men in terms of their projects and women in terms of being women first and their projects only secondarily? Or are there other aspects of life in which we do this? Is it all aspects? The next question that de Beauvoir takes on is what makes woman other? And de Beauvoir acknowledges that it's normal for groups to define themselves in opposition to other groups. She writes, for the native of a country, inhabitants of other countries are viewed as foreigners. Jews are the others for anti-Semites, blacks for racist Americans, indigenous people for colonists, proletarians for the propertied classes. So the thought here, if a people of a particular country want to define their national identity, it's perfectly natural for them to ask themselves, how do they differ from foreigners? In doing this, they set up a contrast between themselves and the others. The same goes for people of a particular religion, or a particular race, or class, or ethnicity. But the thought is, two groups defining themselves in opposition to one another could easily be mutual. The English could define themselves as not being Irish, while the Irish define themselves as not being English. But the case of man and woman is not like this, according to Beauvoir. Man defines woman as not being man, but woman does not define man as not being woman. Instead, woman is defined as not being man. So the question is, why is this? In de Beauvoir's terms, she asks, why does woman submit to being other? De Beauvoir explains that some groups submit to being others because of numerical inequality. She says some groups are others because of a historical event of conquest or oppression. But this won't explain why woman's other. It's not that there are fewer women than men, and it's not as if there's some discrete historical event in which men colonized women. Instead, de Beauvoir points to economic factors, social factors, and what she calls a metaphysical risk. So on the bottom of 9, she writes, economically, men and women almost form two castes. All things being equal, the former have better jobs, higher wages, and greater chances to succeed than female competitors. They occupy more places in industry, in politics, and so forth, and they hold the most important positions. In the next sentence, de Beauvoir refers to prestige, and she cashes out this social factor in more detail on pages 155 and 156. There she writes, factories, offices, and universities are open to women, but marriage is still considered a more honorable career. She writes, parents still raise their daughters for marriage rather than promoting their personal development, and the daughter sees so many advantages that she desires it herself. The result is that she's often less specialized, less solidly trained than her brothers. She is less totally committed to her profession. As such, she is doomed to remain inferior in it, and the vicious circle is knotted. This inferiority reinforces her desire to find a husband. So now, the next thing I want you to consider is to what extent do these economic and social factors still obtain today? De Beauvoir published The Second Sex in 1949, and there's no doubt that the economic and social world has changed since then. But what I want you to think about is to what extent and due to what factors does our economic and social world cause women to become other? As for the metaphysical risk, De Beauvoir writes, "Beside every individual's claim to assert himself as subject lies the temptation to flee freedom and to make himself into a thing." De Beauvoir explains that this is the easy path. The anguish of authentically assumed existence is avoided. De Beauvoir explains that woman needs to expend a greater moral effort than the male, choose the path of independence. And she writes, "It has not been well enough understood that temptation is also an obstacle." So Beauvoir's suggestion here is that there's a risk in freedom, in freely defining yourself, and in freely choosing your own projects. And so given that there are these economic and social factors that cause women to lose her freedom, de Beauvoir thinks woman is happy to lose her freedom because she can avoid this risk. Now the next thing I want you to think about is what's so bad about being other? De Beauvoir addresses this question on 16 and 17. She first says, if we examine some of the books on women, we see that one of the most frequently held points of view is that of public good or general interest. So the question here would be, is it in the common good, or is it in the general interest for women to be other? Would we achieve a greater good for a greater number if women were equal to man, or if women were subject, just as man is? De Beauvoir says that another frequently encountered point of view is women's personal happiness. De Beauvoir considers a series of questions. Are women in a harem not happier than a woman voter? Is a housewife not happier than a woman worker? De Beauvoir writes, we cannot really know what the word happiness means, and still less what authentic values it covers. So de Beauvoir wants to reject these two points of view. She thinks it's not obvious whether women's freedom would bring about a greater good for a greater number. And it's not obvious whether women's freedom would cause her to feel more happiness. But de Beauvoir thinks it doesn't matter either way, because she thinks what's of value isn't happiness or the greatest good for the greatest number, but rather freedom. She explains this on the bottom of 16. She says that she adopts the position of existentialist morality. She explains, every subject posits itself as a transcendence concretely through projects. It accomplishes its freedom only by perpetual surpassing toward other freedoms. Then she writes, there is no other justification for present existence than its expansion toward an indefinitely open future. Every time transcendence lapses into immanence, there is degradation of existence into in itself, of freedom into facticity. This fall is a moral fault if the subject consents to it. If this fall is inflicted on the subject, it takes the form of frustration and oppression, and in both cases, it is absolute evil. So de Beauvoir's claim here is that what justifies life, or what makes a human's life worth living, is their freedom, or their transcendence, their ability to define who they are in their own terms, their ability to freely choose their own projects, and to become who they are through the choice of these projects. So if this is what makes life worth living, or if this is the morally good, then by contrast, the evil would be to rob someone of their transcendence, or to give away one's own transcendence. And now de Beauvoir's claim is that this is what singularly defines the situation of woman. She says woman's drama lies in the conflict between the fundamental claim of every subject, which always posits itself as essential, and the demands of a situation that constitute her as inessential. And so de Beauvoir's thought is that in our economic and social world, women are made into other in the sense that women are unable to define themselves in their own terms, and in terms of their own freely chosen projects. And yet, what makes a human life worth living is the ability to do precisely that, the ability to define oneself freely through one's own choice of one's projects. So de Beauvoir's aim in The Second Sex is to investigate the circumstances that limit women's freedom, and to determine how women can overcome them. So our reading for this week looks at the historical origins of women's situation today. So on the one hand, it looks at human history to see how our economic and social situation has evolved. And on the other hand, it looks at women's personal history to consider how they're raised in our society today. So what I want you to do is to consider these sorts of historical accounts and how well they ring true today. To the extent that they don't, I want you to figure out to what extent our situation today still makes women other, in de Beauvoir's sense. In the reading for next time, de Beauvoir will do more to consider how women can overcome these obstacles. You might start thinking about that already in your essay for this week, although of course we'll revisit it next week. And here's one final thought. In the reading for this week, de Beauvoir writes the best known quote from this book. It's on page 283. One is not born, but rather becomes woman. Now, it's common to gloss this quote by drawing a distinction between sex and gender, between being female on the one hand and being woman on the other. Now, de Beauvoir's thesis in this book is that gender isn't a biological given. Instead, it's somehow socially constructed. To be woman is to be other, or to be other is to be unable to define yourself in your own terms and in terms of your own freely chosen projects. That's not something you're born with. But a question that's worth reflecting on this week is whether sex is something you're born with. Right? De Beauvoir has given us an account of what it is to be woman. But ask yourself, what is it to be female? Is there a single biological fact or a set of biological facts that one is biologically given that makes one female? Or is there some sense in which even sex is socially constructed. And if it is socially constructed, then what could it mean?